In the freezing winter of 1772, inside a grand neoclassical boardroom on Leadenhall Street in the City of London, 24 directors of the Honourable East India Company gathered beneath chandeliers of gilded brass to review the accounts of the most powerful corporate empire the world had ever seen. Their private enterprise commanded a standing army of over 260,000 men, twice the size of the British regular army. It collected taxes from more than 150 million subjects across the Indian subcontinent, operated its own heavily armed navy of ocean-going East Indiamen, governed territories spanning millions of square miles, and accounted for nearly half of the entire maritime trade of the British Empire. To the merchants of the London Stock Exchange and the aristocrats of the British Parliament, the East India Company was not merely an overseas trading venture. It was the unshakable financial foundation of Great Britain's global supremacy, a commercial titan that paid annual cash dividends of 12.5% and funneled millions of pounds in silver, silk, saltpeter, and porcelain directly into the pockets of the British ruling class. Yet on that cold December morning, behind the polished oak doors of Leadenhall Street, the directors were staring into an abyss of catastrophic financial insolvency. The company's London bank vaults were completely empty, having depleted its cash reserves down to a few £1,000 against immediate debt obligations exceeding £1 million sterling. Across the Thames, the Bank of England had abruptly suspended the company's credit line, refusing to accept any further promissory notes or bills of exchange drawn on the revenues of Bengal. In the company's vast brick warehouses along the London docks, over £18 million of imported Chinese tea lay rotting in wooden crates, completely unsellable due to punitive import tariffs and a collapsing European consumer market. The greatest corporate conqueror in human history was hopelessly, irrecoverably bankrupt. If the East India Company collapsed, it would drag the Bank of England, the London banking system, and the entire national credit of Great Britain down into ruin. The stage was set for the original corporate bailout in modern history, a desperate sovereign rescue mission engineered by the British Crown that would paradoxically save the company's balance sheet, trigger the American Revolution across the Atlantic, and transform a private trading syndicate into an autocratic colonial government, whose debts would ultimately be passed on to millions of disenfranchised taxpayers. The physical scale of this global logistics network was staggering for the 18th century. The company maintained a private shipyard at Blackwall on the River Thames, employing thousands of shipwrights, caulkers, and sailmakers to construct the massive 36-gun East Indiamen, the heavy, armed merchantmen that served as the juggernauts of global trade. These vessels, measuring up to 1,500 tons, were floating fortresses designed to withstand tropical typhoons in the Indian Ocean, defend against French privateers in the Atlantic, and transport thousands of tons of spices, calicoes, and tea across 12,000 miles of open sea. Yet the construction and maintenance of this colossal naval fleet required millions of pounds in continuous capital investment, locking the company into fixed operational costs that could only be serviced by continuous, unrelenting territorial expansion. In the coffeehouses around the Royal Exchange in London, particularly Garraway's and the Jerusalem Coffee House on Cowper's Court, merchants, ship captains, and underwriters gathered daily to trade news from the East. Fortunes were made and lost in minutes based on unconfirmed rumors of monsoon failures in Madras or French naval skirmishes off the Coromandel coast. The East India Company had effectively created the modern global financial derivative market, where speculative bets on future commodity shipments and territorial tax revenues were traded long before the physical goods ever arrived in European ports. In the archives of the Bank of England in Threadneedle Street, there is preserved a confidential ledger dated July 1772 containing a handwritten emergency petition from the directors of the East India Company. The petition contained an astonishing, unprecedented request: a direct sovereign loan of £1,400,000 from the British Treasury, equivalent to over £250 million in modern purchasing power, to save the company from immediate commercial liquidation. For 2 centuries, popular history has romanticized the East India Company as a daring saga of merchant adventurers, intrepid trade expeditions, and imperial statecraft that brought wealth and civilization to the British Empire. But the dry numbers inscribed in that 1772 ledger tell a completely different story. The East India Company was not a triumph of free market capitalism. It was an economically hollow, debt-ridden military cartel that extracted astronomical private fortunes for its corporate insiders, while systematically bankrupting both the territories it conquered and the sovereign state that sustained it. How did a private joint stock corporation formed by London spice merchants in 1600 conquer the wealthiest empire in Asia, plunder its treasury into catastrophic famine, and then force the British government to bail it out at the cost of losing the American colonies? To understand how the East India Company reached the brink of financial collapse in 1772, one must trace the explosive expansion of its military operations and the catastrophic miscalculations that followed its conquest of Bengal. In August 1765, in a lavishly decorated ceremonial tent outside the city of Allahabad, the defeated Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II signed a historic treaty granting the East India Company the Diwani, the sovereign right to collect land revenues and administer civil justice across the wealthy provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. In a single stroke of an imperial pen, a private British corporation transformed itself from a foreign merchant trading on the coast into the absolute sovereign tax collector of over 20 million people. In London, company directors and aristocratic shareholders celebrated the Diwani as an inexhaustible goldmine that would generate perpetual wealth. Company share prices on the London Stock Exchange soared vertically from £160 in 1765 to over £280 by 1769, sparking a frenzied speculative bubble that engulfed members of Parliament, High Court judges, and major Scottish and Dutch banking houses. Company directors in London recklessly raised the annual dividend payout from 6% to a staggering 12.5%, promising investors that the territorial tax revenues of Bengal would yield an annual surplus of over £2 million. The financial arithmetic of the conquest seemed miraculously simple. Instead of having to ship millions of ounces of silver bullion from London to India to purchase Indian textiles, tea, and spices, the company would now use the tax money extracted directly from Indian peasants to purchase those very same goods. The corporate ledger had achieved the ultimate extractive dream. The conquered population was being forced to finance the foreign export of their own resources. In the words of contemporary observers, the wealth of an entire civilization was being loaded onto wooden merchant ships without a single penny of real capital entering the country in return. Between 1765 and 1770, the company doubled the land tax rates across rural Bengal, raising gross revenue collections from £800,000 under traditional Mughal rule to over £3 million annually. Armed company collectors and private European agents, known as gamasthas, fanned out across rural districts, confiscating agricultural harvests, forcing peasant weavers to work at fixed below-market wages, and levying brutal punitive fines on any village that failed to meet its monthly revenue quota. Traditional grain storage systems, which had protected Indian communities against seasonal crop shortages for centuries, were outlawed or seized by company officials to create speculative private grain monopolies. Then, in the late summer of 1769, the annual monsoon rains failed across northern and eastern India. A severe agricultural drought gripped the province of Bengal. Traditional rural food reserves had already been stripped away by the company's aggressive grain monopolies, and forced export policies. By early 1770, one of the most horrific human catastrophes in recorded history unfolded across the Bengal countryside. Families were reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and leaves. Entire farming villages were abandoned as starving peasants fled toward Calcutta, collapsing and dying along the roadways from Murshidabad to the Hooghly River. Modern demographic and economic studies calculate that between 1769 and 1773, the Great Bengal Famine killed an estimated 10 million people, roughly one-third of the entire population of the province. Agricultural fields reverted to jungle, irrigation canals collapsed, and the artisanal textile workshops that had clothed the world for centuries were left completely deserted. The vibrant, wealthy province that had once generated 12% of the world's entire manufacturing output was reduced to a vast, desolate graveyard. Yet inside the council house in Calcutta, the company's governing board was concerned with only one metric: corporate revenue. In September 1772, Warren Hastings, the company's newly appointed governor of Bengal, sent a chillingly candid dispatch to the court of directors in London, reporting that despite the loss of at least one-third of the inhabitants and the total devastation of agriculture, the company had successfully collected its full tax revenues through the violent enforcement of collective fines on surviving villagers. When a farmer died of starvation, his surviving neighbors were forced at gunpoint to pay his unpaid tax arrears. Hastings wrote to the London directors, "It was naturally to be expected that the starvation of so many people would have caused an equal reduction in the revenue. But owing to its being violently kept up to its former standard, the net collections of the year 1771 actually exceeded the revenue of the previous year." To the London directors, this appeared as proof of administrative brilliance. But in economic reality, the company had committed financial suicide. It had consumed the seed corn of its own tax base to maintain its paper dividends. The human suffering was immense, but the economic consequence of this ruthless extraction was fatal to the company's own business model. By exterminating one-third of its tax-paying peasantry and wiping out its skilled artisan workforce, the company permanently destroyed the productive foundation of Bengal's economy. Agricultural output collapsed, internal trade grinded to a complete halt, and the cost of maintaining a private mercenary army of over 100,000 soldiers to suppress local rebellions exploded. The company had created an economic desert and called it revenue. Simultaneously, the company was fighting expensive, unprovoked wars of territorial expansion across the subcontinent. In southern India, the company waged the bloody and indecisive First Anglo-Mysore War against the formidable military strategist Hyder Ali, whose modern rocket artillery and cavalry repeatedly routed British forces outside the gates of Madras. In western India, company agents in Bombay launched unauthorized military campaigns against the Maratha Confederacy, incurring millions of pounds in emergency military loans. The military expenditures of the company's three presidency armies rose from £500,000 in 1760 to over £3 million by 1772, consuming every single penny of collected tax revenue and plunging the company into structural operational deficits. The architect of this colossal military extractive machine was an unhinged, bipolar commercial adventurer whose audacity rewrote the history of British imperialism. His name was Robert Clive, born in Shropshire in 1725, the troubled son of a minor country squire who had spent his youth organizing violent protection rackets among local market shopkeepers. Despairing of his violent temper and lack of academic discipline, his father shipped him off to India at the age of 18 to work as an apprentice clerk, or writer, for the East India Company in Madras, earning a meager salary of £5 a year. Bored by clerical bookkeeping and suffering from severe bouts of suicidal depression, Clive volunteered for the company's armed militia during the Carnatic Wars against the French East India Company. Clive was a military natural, fearless, utterly ruthless, and possessing an instinctive genius for political manipulation, bribery, and psychological warfare. In 1751, he achieved international fame by leading a force of 500 men to capture and hold the fortress of Arcot against an army of 10,000 Indian and French troops, earning the praise of British Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder as a heaven-born general. In June 1757, following the capture of Calcutta by the young Nawab of Bengal, Suraj-ud-Dowlah, Clive was dispatched with an expeditionary force and a small naval fleet to retake the settlement. At the legendary Battle of Plassey on June 23, 1757, Clive confronted the Nawab's army of 50,000 men with just 3,000 company soldiers. But the battle was not won by British military prowess. It had been bought weeks in advance in a secret, treacherous conspiracy. Clive had allied with the richest private banking dynasty in India, the Jagat Seths, and entered into a clandestine treaty with the Nawab's ambitious army commander, Mir Jafar. In exchange for betraying his sovereign on the battlefield, Mir Jafar was promised the throne of Bengal, while the East India Company was promised vast territorial grants, tax exemptions, and cash indemnities. To deceive a rival conspirator named Omichund, who demanded a 5% cut of the Nawab's treasury, Clive forged the signature of a British naval admiral, Charles Watson, on a fake treaty printed on red paper. When the battle began, Mir Jafar kept his cavalry motionless, Suraj-ud-Dowlah fled, and Bengal fell to a private commercial syndicate. When Suraj-ud-Dowlah's lines broke at Plassey, Clive marched into the royal treasury of Murshidabad, the capital of Bengal. The treasury was a subterranean vault filled with mounds of gold mohurs, silver rupees, pearls, diamonds, and rubies accumulated over centuries by the Mughal viceroys. Clive walked through the vaults and personally confiscated over £234,000 sterling in gold and jewels for himself, equivalent to over £30 million today, while extracting £2.2 million in cash indemnities for the East India Company. Clive returned to London as the richest commoner in Europe, purchasing an enormous aristocratic estate in Shropshire, buying up pocket boroughs to secure seats in Parliament for his family, and receiving a peerage from King George III as Baron Clive of Plassey. When British parliamentarians later questioned the colossal scale of his private looting, Clive famously replied with unrepentant arrogance, "By God, Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation." Clive established the corrupt corporate culture that defined the company for generations. Private company clerks earning nominal official salaries of £300 a year returned to Britain after a few years in India as fabulously wealthy nabobs, having accumulated vast personal fortunes through illegal private trading monopolies, extortionate currency manipulation, and forced gifts from Indian princes. While individual company servants became multimillionaires, the corporate balance sheet of the company was left to absorb the massive military and administrative overhead of maintaining an empire. The nabobs bought up English country estates, purchased corrupt parliamentary seats, married into the impoverished British aristocracy, and flooded the London social scene with ostentatious displays of Oriental wealth. Figures like Paul Benfield, an East India Company engineer who went to India penniless and returned as the largest private creditor to the Nawab of Arcot, held personal claims of over £500,000 against Indian princely revenues, and controlled 8 members of Parliament through his personal political pocket boroughs. The wealth of India was corrupting the very fabric of British parliamentary democracy. While individual company servants were amassing private fortunes of unprecedented scale, the company's official corporate finances were plunging into a death spiral. Under the terms of the company's charter renewal in 1767, The British Parliament had demanded a direct tribute payment of £400,000 annually from the company's Bengal revenues into the British Treasury. The British state had become an addicted beneficiary of the company's plunder, expecting guaranteed annual payments while turning a blind eye to the administrative chaos and famine in Asia. The systemic contradiction at the heart of the East India Company finally imploded in the summer of 1772, triggering the first global financial contagion in modern history. The speculative frenzy in East India Company stock in London had been financed by an elaborate, fragile pyramid of unsecured bank credit across European financial capitals. Wealthy investors borrowed heavily from private banks to purchase company shares on margin, using the shares themselves as collateral, under the assumption that the 12.5% dividend would continue forever. In June 1772, a prominent Scottish speculator and banker named Alexander Fordyce, senior partner in the London banking house of Neil, James, Fordyce and Down, fled to France after losing over £300,000 speculating on East India Company shares. Fordyce had gambled the bank's entire deposit reserves on the expectation that company stock would rise to £300. Instead, news of the Bengal famine and falling revenues caused the share price to plunge below £200. The immediate collapse of Fordyce's bank on June 8, 1772, triggered a catastrophic domino effect across the British banking sector. Anxious depositors swarmed London banking houses, demanding their cash in gold coin. Over 30 private banks across London and Edinburgh collapsed within days, including the prominent Ayr Bank, Douglas, Heron and Company, which had issued over £1 million in unbacked paper promissory notes and left hundreds of Scottish landowners and merchants completely bankrupt. The panic spread instantly to Amsterdam, the financial capital of 18th century Europe. Dutch merchant banking houses, which had invested millions of guilders in East India Company stock and British government securities, faced sudden runs on their liquidity. The prestigious Amsterdam banking house of Clifford and Sons collapsed in December 1772, freezing international trade credit across Hamburg, Paris, Frankfurt, and Vienna. The European commercial credit market had suffered a systemic stroke. In London, the commercial paper market seized up entirely. The East India Company, which relied on short-term bank loans to finance its trade operations until its seasonal tea auctions in September, found itself completely locked out of the credit markets. The Bank of England, facing severe gold reserve drains of its own, slammed its discount window shut and refused to lend another penny to Leadenhall Street. By the autumn of 1772, the East India Company was facing immediate debt obligations of £1,300,000, including £400,000 in unpaid customs duties owed directly to the British Treasury, with barely £100,000 in liquid cash on hand. To make matters worse, the company was sitting on £18 million of unsold Chinese tea stored in its London warehouses, a massive, illiquid inventory that could not be sold in Britain because of high excise taxes and was being systematically undercut by Dutch tea smugglers in the American colonies. The company was too big to fail. If the East India Company declared bankruptcy, the Bank of England would face immediate collapse, the national debt of Great Britain would lose its primary funding source, and British military power in Asia would evaporate overnight. The British government was forced to step in and engineer the first modern state bailout of a private multinational corporation. The critical political showdown that determined the fate of the company took place in the grand chambers of the British House of Commons and the Treasury offices at 10 Downing Street between November 1772 and May 1773. British Prime Minister Lord North, a pragmatic and cautious Tory statesman, faced a profound constitutional and financial dilemma. Behind closed doors, the Court of Directors pleaded with Lord North for an immediate state bailout. In heated parliamentary debates, radical Whig politicians like Edmund Burke and Isaac Barre launched blistering attacks against the company, exposing the grotesque corruption of the nabobs and the horrific devastation of the Bengal famine. Burke famously declared that the East India Company was a state in the disguise of a merchant, an unaccountable corporate monster that had plundered an empire and now expected the British taxpayer to clean up its financial mess. Burke warned the House of Commons, "The East India Company did not conquer an empire to trade. It traded to conquer an empire. Its servants have plundered the provinces of Bengal with an appetite that knows no satiety, and now that the carcass is picked clean, they come to Parliament demanding that the public purse restore their squandered credit." Lord North understood that the British state could not afford to let the company fail, but he was determined to extract a heavy price for government intervention. In May 1773, Parliament passed two landmark pieces of legislation that permanently altered the course of world history: the Regulating Act of 1773 and the Tea Act of 1773. Under the Regulating Act, the British government granted the East India Company a direct treasury loan of £1,400,000 at 4% interest, while simultaneously suspending the company's dividend payments and subjecting its political and military governance in India to direct Crown supervision through a newly appointed Governor-General in Calcutta and a Supreme Court of Judicature. The British state had effectively nationalized the company's empire while leaving its commercial debts in corporate hands. To enable the company to pay back its government loan, Lord North devised a fateful commercial lifeline: the Tea Act of 1773. Under the Tea Act, Parliament granted the East India Company the exclusive legal monopoly to export its £18 million of surplus tea directly to the 13 American colonies, without paying the standard British import duties, while retaining a small, 3-penny townshend duty payable upon arrival in American ports. Lord North believed this was a brilliant legislative compromise. American consumers would receive high-grade Chinese tea at prices cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea, while the East India Company would liquidate its surplus inventory, generate millions in cash revenue, and repay its Treasury bailout. Lord North's corporate rescue plan proved to be one of the most catastrophic geopolitical blunders in British history. To the American colonists in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, the Tea Act was not a commercial discount. It was a tyrannical violation of constitutional principle. American merchant smugglers, led by wealthy figures like John Hancock, whose illicit tea trade was directly threatened by the company's monopoly, joined with radical political organizers like Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty. They recognized that if the British Parliament could grant a private, state-backed corporation a legal monopoly on tea, it could grant monopolies on wine, textiles, leather, and every other commodity of daily life. Furthermore, paying the 3-penny duty would establish the dangerous legal precedent that Parliament had the constitutional right to tax the unrepresented colonies. In November 1773, East India Company tea ships, including the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor carrying hundreds of chests of Darjeeling and Bohea tea. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of 50 Sons of Liberty disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded the 3 ships, smashed open 342 wooden chests, and dumped 45 tons of East India Company tea, valued at £10,000 sterling, equivalent to nearly $2 million today, directly into the harbor waters. The Boston Tea Party ignited the American Revolutionary War. Parliament responded with furious indignation, passing the punitive coercive acts, closing the port of Boston, and placing Massachusetts under military rule. Within 18 months, British redcoats clashed with colonial Minutemen on Lexington Green. The British government's desperate effort to save the balance sheet of the East India Company had directly cost Great Britain its entire American empire. The institutional corruption was so pervasive that even the highest legal and political authorities in Britain were powerless to halt its momentum. In 1786, the British House of Commons witnessed the opening of the legendary impeachment trial of Warren Hastings, led by Edmund Burke, Charles James Fox, and Richard Brinsley Sheridan. The trial dragged on for 7 agonizing years in Westminster Hall, filling the London newspapers with forensic accounts of extortion, torture, and judicial murder in Bengal. Burke passionately accused Hastings of governing by the standard of his own corrupt appetite, but the financial power of the East India Company ultimately prevailed. Hastings was acquitted by the House of Lords in 1795, proving once again that imperial profits conferred absolute legal immunity. Furthermore, to make up for the collapsing land revenues of devastated Bengal, the company pioneered the state-enforced cultivation of opium across Bihar and Malwa, creating the state-run narcotics monopoly that would later force open imperial China during the Opium Wars. The corporate machine adapted with ruthless efficiency. When Indian agriculture could no longer yield sufficient land taxes, the company turned to drug trafficking across the South China Sea to balance its London ledgers. Robert Clive himself met a tragic and mysterious end. Ostracized by polite British society despite his immense wealth, addicted to increasing doses of opium to manage chronic physical pain and bouts of acute melancholia, and haunted by the parliamentary investigations into his conduct in Bengal, Clive committed suicide at his luxury London townhouse in Berkeley Square in November 1774 at the age of 49. The man who had conquered an empire for a trading syndicate died alone in his bedroom with a penknife, leaving behind an empire that would continue to consume millions of lives and billions in public debt. The profound contradiction that defined the East India Company for the remainder of its existence was that while it continued to conquer vast new territories, subjugating the Marathas, annexing Awadh, and conquering the Sikh Empire in the Punjab, it remained structurally unprofitable and perpetually dependent on British state support. The company had become the world's most militarized corporation, maintaining a standing army of over 260,000 troops by the early 19th century, with over 70% of its entire gross revenues consumed by military budgets, fortress construction, and naval upkeep. In 1784, Parliament passed William Pitt's India Act, establishing a government board of control in London to oversee all political and military decisions in India. In 1813, Parliament stripped the company of its commercial monopoly on Indian trade, throwing the market open to private British manufacturers. In 1833, the Charter Act abolished the company's commercial functions entirely, transforming it into an administrative agency of the British Crown whose sole function was the collection of land revenues and the military governance of India. The corporate house of cards finally collapsed in May 1857, when the Indian sepoys of the Bengal Army mutinied at Meerut, sparking the widespread Indian Rebellion of 1857. The rebellion engulfed northern and central India, requiring 18 months of brutal military campaigns and tens of millions of pounds in British military expenditures to suppress. The British government realized that a private joint-stock corporation could no longer be trusted to govern a subcontinent of 200 million people. In August 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act, officially abolishing the East India Company's governing charter and transferring all territorial sovereignty directly to Queen Victoria and the British Crown, inaugurating the era of the British Raj. Yet the company's final financial transaction was perhaps its most cynical legacy of corporate extraction. When the company was officially dissolved on June 1, 1874, the British government did not absorb the company's colossal accumulated debt of £40 million. Instead, Parliament transferred the entire corporate debt directly onto the public accounts of the newly established British Indian government. For decades, The impoverished taxpayers and starving peasants of India were forced to pay millions of pounds annually in home charges and interest payments to service the debts incurred by the private corporation that had conquered them. The Indian taxpayer was forced to buy the very chains that had enslaved him. I want to be careful here, because this is precisely where serious economic history must be distinguished from simplistic moral melodrama. For generations, popular commentary has often framed the East India Company as either an immaculate engine of British free market enterprise or a cartoonish criminal conspiracy of rogue merchants operating outside the law. The historical reality is far more complex and revealing. The East India Company was neither a free market enterprise nor an isolated criminal gang. It was the ultimate, foundational prototype of state monopoly capitalism. From its very inception in 1600 under Queen Elizabeth I, the company operated through sovereign royal charters that granted it exclusive trade monopolies, legal immunity, the right to mint coins, and the authority to wage offensive warfare on behalf of the British Crown. The British Parliament, the Bank of England, and the British aristocracy were not passive victims of company greed. They were active, invested partners in the enterprise. Over a quarter of all members of Parliament in the late 18th century held East India Company stock or had family members serving in lucrative company administrative posts. The British state depended on the company to provide naval support in Asian waters, secure raw commodities for British manufacturing, and finance the national debt through low-interest corporate loans. When the company succeeded, its private shareholders and executive directors pocketed astronomical dividends and personal fortunes. When the company failed, the British state intervened with public treasury bailouts, regulatory protections, and military armaments, passing the financial liability onto disenfranchised populations across Bengal and the American colonies. The tragedy of the East India Company was not that it broke the rules of the international financial system. It was that it invented the rules of state-backed corporate capitalism that dominate the global economy today. The enduring legacy of the East India Company reaches directly into the modern financial and corporate landscape. It stands as the ultimate historical case study of the catastrophic dangers of corporate state capture, where the boundaries between private enterprise, military force, and public sovereign finance become completely erased. The modern concept of institutions that are too big to fail, entities whose speculative recklessness is privately rewarded in good times, while their systemic failures are publicly socialized through government bailouts, was not invented on Wall Street during the financial crisis of 2008. It was born on Leadenhall Street in the winter of 1772. When megacorporations wield the power to dictate sovereign foreign policy, command private security forces, and demand taxpayer bailouts to protect their extractive profits, history demands that we look past their grand corporate logos and examine the foundational ledgers of conquest, debt, and human subjugation. If you have made it this far, write the word bailout in the comments below, as a reminder that behind every grand imperial narrative sits a private corporate ledger that power sought to conceal. And if you rely on this channel for the hidden financial ledgers beneath official history, subscribe to Chrono Dominion and join us for the next investigation into the transactions the powerful hope time would quietly erase.